I must confess that I am deeply, deeply honored by this gesture of asking me. Honored for a variety of reasons. For what Himal stands for my occasional association with the old magazine and the conversations that Kanak and I had in Kathmandu about what to do and how to take it further forward and so on. About these moments when I was at Lumbini and once again felt this pull of a kind of conversation, as it were, with the past. This doesn't happen very often, and I may sound like a rather crazy historian suggesting this, but there are moments when one stands before something which is from the past and you feel that there is a communication. And that was the kind of feeling I had that day when I went for the second time to Lumbini. The first time was a rough ride because I went in '58 when I was writing my thesis on the Mauryas and I was visiting all the Ashokan sites. And we went through this complete jungle in a jeep. And the chap who was driving us kept saying, border aa raha hai, passport nahi hai aapke paas. And I said, no, I don't have a passport. I didn't know that we were crossing a border. But then when I said to him, all right, then, you know, we won't go. And he said, no, we'll go and you just walk through. Nobody will say anything. And sure enough, we just walked through. It was dense forest, but nobody said anything. This time it was very different, of course. It was full of monasteries built by people from all over the world and manicured gardens and all kinds of other modern amenities that, in a sense, it was a kind of escape to actually go and stand in front of the pillar and get away from all this and imagine this little bit of communication. Chakravarti, and I feel extremely privileged that I should have been asked to do it this time. I told Kanak that I wouldn't make a speech, and he said, no, you must speak for just 5 minutes. So I will speak for hopefully just 5 minutes, maybe 10. And inevitably, being the kind of person I am, I'm going to take a long-term perspective, what the great French historian Braudel called la longue durée, which is really looking at the past in great distance. And my perspective really begins with concern with this concept. The new incarnation of the magazine speaks of the Southasian, and he takes it all the way from Afghanistan to Burma, from the Maldives to Tibet, which is possibly a little larger than the Southasian that we're normally used to, which is a little more constricted. But anyway, today this region is divided into a large number of nation-states, defined territorially by their boundaries, and the boundaries are neat lines on maps. I would like to go back and say a little bit about boundaries. What are boundaries? For most of our history, and I'm talking about 3,000 years, for most of our histories, boundaries were just topographical features. There was a mountain, there was a river, there was a forest, there was a desert. And that determined what lay on this side, what lay on that side, and what this boundary was about. It was a large, undefined area regarded as a frontier region. It wasn't a thin line across a map. It was actually something that existed on the ground. Not very precisely controlled by anybody, vague, and one region faded into the other, one region overlapped with the other. There was a general kind of vagueness about the notion of the frontier and the boundary. Frontiers, therefore, were porous, they were open, and they also moved. And what I mean by this is that when a river shifted course, and you have rivers like the Sutlej which shifts course very frequently, the boundary also shifted. Or you have a forest, which is a boundary, a frontier region between two kingdoms, and the king wishes to raise his revenue and encourages his peasants to go and clear the forest and settle down and start cultivating. So the boundary shifts in accordance with the area that is cleared and settled. And these are then frontiers where cultures mix. That is the characteristic of a boundary. That is the characteristic of the frontier in the old days. These are areas that do not define themselves by a single culture. They essentially define themselves by mixed cultures. The other thing is, of course, that boundaries change every century. I mean, if you're a historian and you try and map the boundaries, which you can't do very successfully because there were no lines in those days, they keep on changing. Every century, the map looks different. The configuration is different. And I do want to emphasize the fact that these claims to ownership of territory and control that we make today are really very evanescent claims, because there is no such thing as an immutable boundary, a boundary that doesn't change. Then all of this was going on, and then came cartography, and that was when boundaries became different and our whole attitude to boundaries changed. Maps were made, partly with topographical features. You still had the rivers and the deserts and the mountains and all the rest of it, but you also had mapped villages and towns. The human element comes into the territory, and the human element also contributes to the making of the boundary. The maps change. There is an appropriation towards trying to be precise. If you look at 15th century maps, they're large blocks of land based in a context of the sea, in the ocean. And then slowly they get more and more precise until you come to the late 19th century when precision is very important. Now, in saying all this, and saying that cartography plays a very important role in the notion of a boundary, because that is, when you get the map, you get the black line. And you get this idea of this is foreign, this is home, and that kind of thing, much more clearly demarcated. And then you have the great exceptional boundary of olden times, the Great Wall of China, which I think is a marvelous contrast to the Indian concept, because in India you always had, by India I mean the Southasian region, you always had this notion if somebody was alien or whatever it was and was coming in, you adjusted socially. You made them into the lowest caste, and you gave them a caste name, and you fixed them in society. Not the Chinese. The Chinese built the wall and said, you stay outside, we stay on this side of the wall. And I think the Chinese wall is therefore historically very significant at levels other than the obvious. Now, what happens with cartography then is, and the politics that goes with cartography and the defining of boundaries, is that what was porous and open and free becomes narrow and becomes defined, and it becomes extremely tightly controlled. There is, with the creation of the nation state and the emergence of the middle class, there is, of course, this concern with territory. Territory is extremely important to the definition of a nation. And then cartography and maps and the making of boundaries also become extremely important. Some degree of porosity remains. I remember being very impressed a few years ago when I went to a village near Jodhpur, where the famous Maghania musicians from Rajasthan were performing. And at the end of the performance, I was speaking to some of them, and I said, you must be having a very difficult time. Do you get patrons to ask you over to weddings to perform? And he said, yes, no problem at all, because you see, we have all of Rajasthan, we have all of Sindh. And I said, what do you mean you have all of Sindh? And he said, well, when there's a wedding on that side, we all go off and we perform there. And when there's a wedding on this side, they all come across here. So, you know, we are very prosperous. We have patronage from both sides. And I was stunned. I said, but you know, what about the border? And these guys just laughed and said, border? Which border? It's all open. We come and go. So, you know, there are different layers and levels at which one is looking at the nation state and its definition and its boundaries. Again, these boundaries, the boundaries mapped and drawn on a map, change. As we know, within 1 century, we've had massive changes in the boundaries of the South Asian region. Given these, what I call barrier boundaries, unlike the earlier pre-cartographic boundaries that were really just frontier zones and open frontiers, the barrier boundaries raise then the question much more clearly of what is South Asian. When we have these boundaries of nation states, how do we then call ourselves South Asian? And I would say that the South Asian is essentially addressing the issue of the question. As a historian, I would say that it is the inheritance of history that makes us South Asian. The sharing of history, and by sharing I don't mean that we all have the same history, no. We have different histories, and these histories trickle across, and we accept the histories of our sharing of a history, not that our history and the way it's going to remain. So there isn't really the idea of saying that one's inheritance lies in one's history is not to say that there is a single pattern of history that is imposed right through the region. Not at all. On the contrary, one is much more concerned at looking at the variations and looking at the negotiations and adjustments that regions are constantly making to their pasts. What I would like to compare it with is a kind of action of what we as children, when we were taught embroidery, was called chain stitch. That you make a loop, you put the needle through it, and you take the thread forward, and then you make another loop, and you put the needle through it and take the thread forward, and you get this little chain stitch that puts together bits of cloth. Now, I see civilization not as a pattern that is to be imposed on an area. This is a 19th century idea. Civilization was defined by language to that. That was it. And that was India, China, Europe, Greek, whatever it may be. I see it really much more as a kind of chain stitching. What do I mean by this? That there is one region which has a relationship with its neighbor. That neighbor, together with this relationship, has a relationship with its neighbor. That neighbor, together with these two relationships, has a relationship with its neighbor. And so this chain stitching goes on from region to region. But like the thread in the chain stitch, there is an element that continues through. In spite of the loops being new, there is an element that continues through. Don't ask me what the civilizational element is. I haven't worked it out. But I have a kind of fond belief that there is this element that continues all the way across. Each region then looks upon its neighbor as linked. And so you have a series of links right across the region. And each link is actually a cultural nodule. So I think that if one is looking for what is South Asian, one has to look for these cultural nodules, not this large pattern which is to be superimposed on the region, but these nodules that keep coming up each time there is a relationship between one region and another. So today, despite these barrier boundaries, I think we need to look for and to define these cultural nodules in order to understand in what way we are South Asians. And this, I feel, may provide a different nuance to nationalism, which may, in fact, not only make the South Asian region, South Asian, a more viable category, but it may also perhaps help us solve some of our political problems as expressed in this whole notion of boundaries that cut you off, that are obstacles, that are barriers to the people who are living on either side of you. I think that that whole notion needs to be reconsidered, and history has to play a very important part in that. In other words, we have in our identification of the South Asian, certainly the problem of the base, the people, very often very similar, very often facing the same problems, which we don't emphasize sufficiently between region and region. But we also have to, if I may use the old cliche, look at the superstructure and see these cultural nodules and see how they are being appropriated, internalized, interiorized in different regions. And then maybe we will begin to understand much more clearly what we mean by South Asian. And I think in this, a magazine like Himal, especially in its new incarnation, can play an extremely important role, an extremely positive role, in terms of simply exploring this idea, which I think desperately needs exploration. Thank you.